Hello everyone, and welcome to the third of our Material History seminars for 2025. This one will be talking about colonial tourism, objects of Martindale Hall. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and I'm delighted that you've been able to join us today. Can I begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of culture and of country, and pay my respects to elders past and present. But I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who may be joining us today. Material Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Old Treasury Building, Deakin University, and the Australian Catholic University. And I'd especially like to acknowledge the wonderful co-curator of this series, Dr. Lorinda Kramer of Deakin University. In each discussion, we explore an aspect of material history through an object or a series of objects. The seminars are open to anyone who's interested in material history, and we hope to cast the subject net widely in terms of both time and place. So if you're interested in contributing, please get in touch. We'll pop some email addresses on the screen at the end of the seminar. Now, we have two fabulous speakers today, each of whom will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. That will be followed by a short discussion between the speakers and then questions from you, our audience. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Professor Emerita Margaret Allen from the University of Adelaide. Margaret has researched gendered histories and also transnational and post-colonial histories, focusing upon India, Australia from 1880 to about 1940. In an ARC project, Beyond Empire, Transnational Religious Networks and Liberal Cosmopolitanisms, she examined the emergence of faith-based cosmopolitanisms in the interstices of multi-faith, multicultural and multiracial contexts, connected webs around India in the late colonial period. This particular paper today, though, emerges from another ARC project entitled Slow Digitisation, Community Heritage and the Objects of Martindale Hall, and her paper is entitled Spoils from the Tour of the East. Over to you, Marg.
Oh, thank you very much, Margie and Lorinda, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be speaking here. I echo Margie in acknowledging the First Nations of the Naarm region, and I also wish to acknowledge the Kaurna people on whose land I live and where the Flinders and Adelaide universities are located. But I also want to acknowledge the Ngurri people on whose land Martindale Hall was built, and the Ngau and Bungala peoples of the Eyre Peninsula, where the Mortlock family initially made their wealth. This project was part of an ARC project led by Penny, and she will talk later about the slow digitisation. The research team includes historians, archaeologists, Indigenous peoples, and, well, it says media and technology, and I'll change that here to digital humanities specialists. And here's a slide of the team. The top left, we have the Ngurri Elders Heritage and Land Care Council, and other people you may know, archaeologists, historians, and digital humanities experts. Now, I just want to start by showing you Martindale Hall was built, a stately home, Georgian style, was built by the wealthy young pastoralist Edmund Bowman in 1879-80 on his Mintaro property near Clare, South Australia. It's now a house museum. But probably many of you will know it from the 1975 film Picnic at Hanging Rock, where the hall was Miss Appleyard's school. One of the objects of the research the project is to research the complex layers of meaning associated with Martindale Hall, including its landscape, objects, archives, and people, to improve public access to the cultural heritage assets. We aim to take a post-colonial look at Martindale Hall and the people who built it, lived in it, and worked in it. We aim to examine the sources of wealth of the people who owned the hall, and today chiefly we'll be looking at the Mortlock family. Generally, visitors to such stately homes, museums get an account of the worthy family founders, their activities, admire the grand houses and the marvellous and interesting collections of furniture and objects within it, and then go to the gift shop and hopefully have a cream tea. However, we think it's important that visitors think more widely about the power and imperial relationships in such history. So we're looking to open up Martindale Hall to a broader global context to situate its stories. So we're sort of taking a type of post-colonial approach, and we're using the word reworlding, and we ask new questions of the Mortlock family. In the UK, as you know, new questions are being asked about stately homes and their owners as a consequence of the work of the legacies of British slavery, and also on the fruits of imperialism, for example, particularly in India, which came back to the colonizing power. So our work is very much in tune with international movements in museums and national histories, and which focus on the impact of colonialism and its racial hierarchies and oppressions on the modern world. I'm sure you're probably aware of the Legacies of British Slavery website, where they were able to identify a whole lot of families, mostly in Britain, but some, of course, in the colonies, who benefited, who were slave owners, and they are identified because they got compensation when the British abolished slavery. And then various studies have followed where that money went and to the wonderful stately homes of Britain. And also, there's been another study of the East India Company. And so the East India Company as well generated a whole lot of wealth that the British brought back and then, of course, put into their home. And so the findings of this East India Company project, particularly the book, which is online and free, East India Company at Home, recent research has shown that much of the British stately homes display and embody the spoils of imperial warfare, trade and bureaucratic service. Here the material traces of African conquest, Caribbean slavery and the Indian Raj have come home to rest on British soil. So when we're looking at Martindale Hall, we're very aware, of course, it is, of course, a very grand house and one of the many large houses of the type scattered across Australian landscape, built by those who made their fortunes in pastoral mining ventures or land speculation. These houses basically had imposing entrances, large rooms, private quarters for the family upstairs, and of course some little small living quarters for the servants. But the money that basically financed the Mortlock the Martindale Hall came from wealth stolen from Indigenous lands. Thomas Bowman, the family that first owned it, said, "We've taken the lands from the blacks." And W.R. Mortlock, who was the first of the Mortlock family in Australia, built his wealth from the 1850s in Eyre Peninsula, an area with the worst race relations in the colony. There was a war between settlers and the Bangala and the Nau people. And the settlers were the magistrates, the squatters were the magistrates. They were stuck together and looked out for each other. And we find in court cases intimidations of witnesses and officials. In court, Mortlock said everybody knew it was the general practice of the bush to thrash the natives when they deserved it, being the only way of managing them. And as you can see, the Mortlock estates spread and they were able to acquire more and more land. I'll just talk about two incidents. In 1849, 5 Aboriginal people died after eating poisoned flour, which they took from a hut on Mortlock's station there. The hut keeper was charged with murder, but then released and fled the colony. We can't say Mortlock agreed to this, but certainly he benefited, and it was in his interests to use that terrible phrase, to clear the land. Another case happened a little later, 1859. Mortlock's brother-in-law, Andrew Tennant, was said to have beaten an Aboriginal man to death. and the government resident Port Lincoln, Andrew Murray, ordered an inquest to see if there should be a trial. The jury was set up with Mortlock as the foreman and other close tenant connections on the jury. So this is about the squatters all sticking together. Mortlock was hardly impartial. He said the investigation was frivolous and it might probably seriously affect the character of Mr. Andrew Tennant, who was just a young man entering the world. So the charges were not pursued, and the resident who tried to bring them soon lost his job. The Tennant and Mortlock family, were very intermarried. Mortlock, his wife was a tenant, and Mortlock also served in the House of Assembly, and his estate when he died was £100,000. His heir was William Tennant Mortlock, who purchased Martindale Hall in 1891, and his bride was another tenant, Rosie Tennant. When they married, Andrew Tennant, who we've heard of before, gave them a magnificent gift of £20,000 on the wedding day. So I, sort of thinking about how that money is sort of tainted. They enjoyed a grand life at Martindale Hall, and they made a grand tour of Europe in 1903 and brought back several items to display. A visitor to the hall said it is no surprise to see a large collection of native weapons and utensils gathered from various parts, including some from Aden, London, and the interior of Australia. Lots of our attention is focused upon the smoking room, where these objects and those collected by further generations of the family were displayed. And I'll just give you a few images of it. This is some fancy technical thing which lets you see through the walls of the room. Here's the desk where basically I think Mortlock smoked. Some of the items there will be discussed, mentioned today. There's a whole array of indigenous weapons. We haven't been able to identify all of them yet. And this is a Japanese armor from, I think, the 15th century. On the left is a Sri Lankan mask, and we've been able to trace the story of that. And it is in front of, or it is surrounded by these Egyptian textiles, tourist textiles, and you can see them again on the right. And we think they were collected by W.T. and Rosie in about 1903. But curiously, above on the right is a bust of Churchill with a cigar stuck in his mouth. So it's all sort of rather eclectic. So these are the two men of the next generation. John Andrew Tennant inherited in 1913. I would just say that there are about 350 items, I think, in and around the smoking room. And we've made a number of object biographies, which are on our web page. We've made 12. I mean, ideally, it would be wonderful to make them of every single object, but I don't think we could. Now, as I said, we call him Jack Mortlock on the left, inherited in 1913. And he undertook a number of travels to Sri Lanka in 1920, the Tour of the East, which we'll discuss shortly, in 1930. He went up to Queensland and the Barrier Reef in 1936 to 7. He went to Sydney for the New South Wales Centenary in 1938 and toured New Zealand in 1940 for the anniversary of Waitangi Treaty. His brother Ranson also toured a lot, and the Ranson was the second son. So, and what we think is that in looking at their Tour of the East and at the Hall, it's important to bring up these difficult histories and to understand how the oppression and exploitation of the past has contributed to the present. So, the Tour of the East is what these two fellows dubbed the tour they made in 1930 with their manager, Mr. Scarfe. the 3-month trip took them to Java, Singapore, Penang, Sri Lanka, and India. They travelled first class, stayed in grand hotels, and acquired a significant number of souvenirs and curios to display. Jack had a movie camera and they made a film of the entire trip. Their wealth made it possible for them to make such a tour in the depths of the Great Depression, when about a third of the South Australian workforce were unemployed and many were other on short wages. The Indigenous people from whose forebears the Mortlock family had taken the lands were dependent upon rations on missions and stations. They weren't even eligible for the miserly dole available to white workers. And I'll just show you this slide where some of the white workers were living in the Depression. Just to show you some of the sources we were able to use. We were able to use Jack's diary. We had a travel brochure showing the itinerary across India. We have newspaper reports. We have the movie where you can see 3 months tour in the East in the bottom right. That's the sort of slide that they developed. And you've got maps and objects as well. We found all sorts of things in the hall, not necessarily on display, but a whole lot of old travel brochures. We uncover the imperial power relations which lay behind and pervaded the white colonial sphere within which they travelled in virtually the last decade of the empires in the East. They spent their trip as a sort of imperial journey because they voyaged in British and Dutch colonial possessions. As white British subjects, they were free to travel where they wished and were protected throughout by the colonial police and military forces. They enjoyed visiting places which embodied British imperial power, like the naval base in Singapore, the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta, and the Memorial Well in Cawnpore, where memorialised the British victims of the First War of Indian Independence, often referred to as the Indian Mutiny. They, of course, also viewed the great monuments of Asian civilization. They had an eye for the exotic and bizarre. They filmed a fight between a mongoose and a snake in an Indian market. And while they purchased the usual souvenirs and artefacts such as a kris or dagger in Java, a model of the Taj Mahal in India, and brassware in India and Sri Lanka, in Mumbai, they purchased some very brightly coloured reproductions of Hindu gods. We found them, I think, in a drawer. They weren't on display. It's likely that they bought these reproductions in a bazaar in Mumbai. Well, I think the Mortlock family probably bought them because they found them strange and bizarre. But typically Hindu families would put them up in their homes to adorn a domestic shrine where they would perform puja and worship rituals. One of the travel brochures we found was this of the Dutch shipping line, the ship they got on in Sydney and went up to Java on. It's quite interesting to look at the people who are coloured here are carrying the baggage or working on the wharf. And here we have the sort of gaily dressed Westerners with the pith hat just walking along to get on, enjoy their trip. I just want to make the point too, we just want to focus on the Mortlocks. We want to look at what's happening to other people. So their easy mobility was in contrast to that of the Indians, the Javanese, all those people they encountered on their travels, who under the terms of the Immigration Restriction Act were seen as prohibited immigrants. And they'd been resident in Australia before the White Australia policy. They'd been resident in Australia for quite a few years and were seen as good character. They could enter and return Australia as long as they carried a certificate like this, certificate exempting them from the dictation test. So I found Frank Muhammad was on the ship that they came back from Mumbai on to Perth. He was a long-time resident of New South Wales, but each time he went, he had to provide photographs, character references, thumbprints on each occasion. And then as they got to Australian port, all these people who, the coloured people, using my inverted commas, and the crew, coloured crew, were all mustered on deck and checked in full sight of everybody. So it's quite a humiliating process. But I want to talk just now, finally really, about their trip to Yogyakarta. They visited the Sultan's palace and saw of a parade of his retainers. Apparently it was sent for the Prophet's birthday. Yogyakarta, as you probably know, is the centre of Javanese fine arts and crafts. So on the left in the film, you can see the Dutch colonial officials coming in. But we think, or we're sure, that in Jogja, they purchased the Javanese lampshade, which is presently in the billiard room. And we've tried to, throughout, tie particular objects as to the places where they were purchased. It currently stands at the billiard room. It's made of black wrought iron, coppery coloured metal, and made for kerosene originally, but now electricity. It's fragile, made of buffalo hide, incised with a geometric pattern and gilded. The colours and patterns are reminiscent of the Jogja style in batik. In August, they sent about a day or two in Jogja. Such lampshades were made in there, and they used the workmen used similar skills to what they used to make the wayang kulit or shadow puppets. Indeed, on the panel at the front, there is basically a silhouette of a shadow puppet from the Mahabharata, of course, an ancient Hindu epic, frequently performed with wayang kulit puppets in Java. What we discovered is that in the first decades of the 20th century, the traditional arts of Jogja were declining under colonialism, and the Javanese nobility could no longer commission works or commission the silverware. And so a foundation was set up, and that's a picture we got from a museum in Amsterdam of the shop of this foundation. And what they did was they developed patterns and products which brought in Western things and which would be acceptable to American tourists and to the Dutch colonials who lived there. And so what we're saying, this is very much a hybrid object and probably the only one in an Australian collection. I just want to say, I think I'll run out of time here, but it was a time of great nationalists, but they very much are seeing the world from the colonialists' point of view, sympathies with the colonialists. And they did not engage with the peoples of the region. They were a spectacle. And Jack Mortlock said when he got back to Fremantle, we were very pleased to see our white people and to note the absence of the smells and sordid sights of the East. And just there, that's our webpage.
Marg, that was terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was such a great paper. What an amazing journey. And extraordinary that people could spend all that time and learn so little. We will move on now to our second speaker, Professor Penelope Edmonds. Penelope is Matthew Flinders Professor of History at Flinders University. She researches in 19th century British Empire and settler colonialism in the Australia-Pacific region, and also transnational post-colonial histories, heritage, and museums. She brings a critical theory perspective to questions of colonialism, race, reconciliation and redress, humanitarianism, slavery, and unfreedom in the Australian and Western Pacific region. She also has broad industry and professional experience in the glam sector. On the board of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, she was involved with the development and delivery of its landmark apology to Tasmanian Indigenous peoples in 2021. Her paper today is entitled Joe Timbury's Boomerang and the Politics of 1938. Thanks, Penny.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you to Katie also for inviting us to speak. And I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from beautiful Ghana land today. And also, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking about the people of La Perouse, just south of Sydney, and the Gweagal peoples of New South Wales, and pay my respect to elders past and present. And I want to acknowledge sovereignties never ceded in lands and waters, which of course is, I think, appropriate to this paper. I'm glad that Marg has given you a wonderful introduction to our project. I think that she also included the link there to our new website, which was just launched a few months ago. That was the martindalestories.org website. So we'd love you to take a look at it. It's full of new information about Martindale Hall. And we wanted to, of course, showcase the hall and to investigate how community history, heritage and cultural collections can be better preserved and made accessible through what we called slow digitisation techniques and through innovative digital technologies, which we sought to test. Margaret's already described our wonderful interdisciplinary team, and we also had the support of Flinders University and The Void, which is an immersive virtual reality motion capture studio, and we really wanted to take a history project into that studio and to see what we could do. I'll speak a little bit about slow digitisation, and we wanted to use this approach rather than what some scholars have described as fast and mass digitisation. So we wanted to use this to support meaningful, connected and sustainable approaches to the digitisation of community-embedded built heritage and their collections. So rather than mass digitisation, we wanted to use a selective and curated approach. We envisioned slow digitisation to be a curated consultative process with the community to tell us which objects they thought were meaningful, rather than rushing and doing a kind of salvage digitisation as a mass preservation technique, which can often lead to, disconnected archives, incomplete stories if that mass of digitised material is not curated properly. We instead wanted to select objects very carefully. Most of them were related to the smoking room itself, and to use multivocal stories to make the objects meaningful in every stage of the digitisation process. So from the selection of the objects themselves to the creation of digital copies to display and the storage of digital works. And I want to acknowledge Associate Professor Tully Barnett of our team, who is a digitisation specialist in the humanities. We also used, of course, the object biography method, which you will be, of course, very familiar with, to open fresh vistas and unexpected connections and new worlds onto the house. We didn't want tired old narratives of a historic house. In some ways, we wanted to turn the house inside out and explore new local, national and imperial connections that really no one had properly researched before, partly because of a lack of funding, of course, but also we were bringing, I guess, new imperial questions to the objects in this house. And we were very inspired by an evocative quote by the scholar and writer Delia Falconer, who says that making objects the entry point of research is like walking through the back door of history. You don't necessarily end up at the front of the same house. We found that very inspiring and particularly apt for Martindale Hall. In fact, we started making jokes that maybe this quote from Delia Falconer helped us get the ARC grant. I'm just going to show you a few shots here now quickly of our team working online, looking at the 3D modelling process. So this is a visualisation of the smoking room, but our wonderful digital archaeologist who's on the top right of the screen there, Mr. Jared Coelsler, his Dr. Coelsler, is showing us how he has modelled the skull of a dugong that was mounted on the wall, and he's actually spinning it in the space there. And these are just some shots of us presenting at the South Australian History Festival a couple of years ago in the Void, the virtual reality motion capture studio. So the Martindale Hall and the smoking room is projected all around us and all around the audience. And the picture on the right, I particularly love. That's of Marg, and you can see there's a crocodile is actually spinning above her head as she speaks. It's almost like a hologram. And there's a few more shots of our audience and our team. But I'm going to go quickly now to the smoking room and turn closer to home to think about Indigenous objects in the smoking room, and particularly Joe Timbury's boomerang. There are over several hundred artefacts in the smoking room, and it's often referred to as the trophy room or the weapons room, and it really symbolises imperial and pastoral power and wealth par excellence, which I think Marg has communicated to you. It's one of a kind in Australia, and many people have been drawn to this room, wanting to know much more about it and how it was assembled over time. No, on one hand, the smoking room shows an appreciation of the cultures of the world, and I think we should enjoy the pleasure of looking at this wonderful array of artefacts. On the other hand, we know that many of the artefacts were collected through the incredible wealth of the Mortlocks, the financial power of pastoralism, and Marg's also taken you through the entanglements of the Mortlocks with the violent frontier in Port Lincoln. So there's an eclectic mix of artefacts on the wall, including Egyptian textiles, Papuan and Pacific objects, quite a few Aboriginal objects, around 80, a dugong skull and other kinds of collections, including smoking paraphernalia and opium pipes. Now, one object at in the smoking room that we became very intrigued by was a boomerang. It's sitting behind a door. It's a bit hard to see. That's just another shot there of the smoking room and an older pictures of the smoking room. But this object was sitting amongst other objects. We became very intrigued about it, and we wanted to know much more about this particular boomerang and its finely engraved motifs, and especially the vignette in the middle, which was very intriguing. We came to understand that it was made by the Aboriginal man, Joe Timbury, from the La Perouse community, and he was a famous boomerang maker and boomerang thrower from this community. There's a picture of him, and I will be showing some pictures of Joe Timbury in this talk that are on the public record. It's a varnished boomerang. It's made of pine, and the detail markings feature what is known as poker work, coloured with inks. If we use an object biographical approach, this object, of course, opens an unexpected window onto not just Joe Timbury, but onto modern political history of Australia and the 20th century. That's the boomerang mounted on the wall, and there's a close-up of the central vignette on the boomerang, and I'll go closer in. How did Jack Mortlock, who is the third Mortlock, how did he come across this boomerang? Who collected it? Because it really is a boomerang from the 20th century. It's not an older boomerang, and we knew that more research was needed. If you take a closer look at this central vignette, you'll see that it depicts the arrival of Captain James Cook's ships to the eastern coast of Australia in 1770. two Guigal men of the Dharawal nation stand on the beach of Camay or Botany Bay, brandishing spears at an approaching longboat, and a two-masted ship lies offshore. Inscribed above this is, quote, Captain Cook's Landing, opposed by natives, Botany Bay, April 28, 1770. There's also the curious name Gunthor down on the left there. And there's a further inscription which reads, made by Joe Timbery, La Perouse, Sydney. So we believe the boomerang was made by tourists, but the message itself on the boomerang offers a narrative of historic resistance, reminding viewers that Cook's first landing on Guigal country was not welcomed by Aboriginal Australians. And the central scene is also surrounded by pokerwork designs of native flora and fauna, such as waratahs, Christmas bells, kookaburras, an emu, a koala in a tree, and a kangaroo. So we were very interested to consider the way that Joe Timbery had incorporated this iconic image of Guigal man resisting settlement on a boomerang that was very, very likely made for tourism. These are some images from the National Library of Australia showing Joe making boomerangs. On the left there, he's shaping a boomerang at Botany Bay. This was taken in 1963 by Jeff Carter. And then on the right, he's throwing boomerangs. As many of you will know very well, Cook's landing at Botany Bay in 1770 on Australia's coast has been commemorated in settler Australia as a peaceful moment. But of course, Cook himself recorded an encounter characterised by misunderstanding and hostility. On 29th of April 1770, he wrote that two men who seemed resolved to oppose our landing. As soon as we put the boat in again, they came to oppose us, upon which I fired a musket between the two. Later, the Guigal men threw stones and spears at Cook and his crew to scare them away, and Cook's crew responded by firing a gun 3 times at the men, wounding one in the leg. And when the men left, Cook and his crew were able to land. So this scene of first encounter is well known to many of us as Australian historians. But what's interesting is that ancestors of Joe Timbery are reported to have been present when James Cook and later Arthur Phillip arrived in Botany Bay. So Joe Timbery was a descendant, or is a descendant, of senior Dharawal man Timbery, that's Timbere, or Timbery, who was born in around 1784 and passed away in 1840. He was born at Charcoal Creek near Wollongong in New South Wales. At a gathering in Parramatta in 1816, the Aboriginal leader Timbery was named King of the Five Islands by Governor Lachlan Macquarie. He was presented with a metal breastplate with the inscription, Joe Timbery, Chief of Five Islands. The breastplate itself was lost for 90 years after his death, but it was found in an excavation at La Perouse in 1929 and then acquired by the Australian Museum in Sydney, where it's now on display. And I will show you this engraving of Dharawal leader Timbery. And this is a picture of the breastplate at the Australian Museum in Sydney. So because of the engraving that I've shown you, we know that pictorial scenes of Guigal men urging the ships to go away were present even in the 19th century, the late 19th century. The image that I showed you was published in the picturesque Atlas of Australasia in 1866, offering a vignette very similar to that on the Timbery boomerang. So had Joe Timbery seen this image in the Atlas of Australia, I imagine this image was used quite a lot. I believe it was in some school textbooks at the time. So it was in circulation. From the mid to the late 1800s, Aboriginal people at La Perouse created art objects such as boomerangs, shields, and clubs, which were decorated with engravings or paintings. Many of you in Sydney will be very well aware of this. The community at the time sold these items to tourists who were visiting the beachside area in increasing numbers. La Perouse, as many will know, was accessible at the end of the tram line and had become a popular tourist destination for day trippers from Sydney. Aboriginal women from La Perouse also, of course, became known for their beautiful shell work designs decorating boxes, boomerangs, and other items with shells collected at La Perouse and nearby along the New South Wales coastline. In fact, Jo's grandmother, Emma Timbury, was known as Queen or Granny Timbury, and she was a very skillful and renowned shell worker who also sold her works to tourists, and she exhibited at Sydney's Royal Easter Show. Jo Timbury himself also sold his boomerangs in the Rocks area of Sydney. Now, while many of Jo's boomerangs were carved from local mangrove wood, this particular boomerang is made from pine. And it may indicate the need to use other more easily available materials to meet the needs of a growing tourist market. So in this picture here, you can see members of the Timbury family standing outside their boomerang shop at the museum in La Perouse. That's also from 1963, a photo by Jeff Carter in the National Library. So Timbury, of course, by this time was quite famous for making boomerangs and other artefacts that were painted with motifs, including flora and fauna. He also carved or designed iconic images with, say, for example, the Harbour Bridge. And these works showed links to land and traditional cultural practices, along with changing circumstances for the Aboriginal community. A collection of Jo's handcrafted boomerangs are displayed today at the La Perouse Museum, courtesy of the Wollongong Aboriginal Corporation. I'm going to turn now to the Mortlocks and to ask why were they in Sydney? Did they collect this item from Sydney? What were they doing there? Well, we think that they probably collected the boomerang or purchased the boomerang as a tourist object during the 1938 sesquicentenary celebrations of British settlement in Australia, or 150 years of settlement in Australia, which occurred in Sydney in that year. And it was also coupled with the Empire Games. Now, I think you will have gathered from Margaret's talk that the Mortlocks, in fact, Jack Mortlock was a keen man of empire. He had 2 years later, he also went to Waitangi Day, and his chauffeur, Thrum, who was an amateur cameraman, would capture images actually of the Waitangi ceremonies where there were Maori troops lined up, ready, in fact, to go to the Second World War. So those are very, very interesting home movies that we have unearthed. But back to Sydney, we know that Jack Mortlock and his chauffeur Thrum were there because they talk about it in their diaries, and they would go off on various jaunts in their car. And it's likely that they purchased this boomerang when they were in Sydney. These are just some newspaper articles that we found in Mortlock's diaries of the celebrations from January 1938. Right, also in the smoking room are banners from the British Empire Games of the same year. So I started to, put these together and think, well, if they went to the British Empire Games, they probably saw the sesquicentennial celebrations, and then they probably also would have been exposed to tourist objects. So these are felt banners from the Empire Games. We know that some 40,000 people attended the Empire Games ceremony. And in his diary, chauffeur Thrum, who seemed to be a sort of man of all trades, he seemed to be sort of Mortlock's second man, best man, recorded in his memoirs in 1938, we travelled to Sydney for Australia's 150th celebrations, buying seats in one of the many stands erected for the occasions. We had an excellent view of the procession. It took about 1.5 hours to pass. I took many reels of film. I remember it was a very hot day and the St. John's ambulance was really working overtime. It must have been about 1 million people there. Mortlock's diary also concurs. This is now held at the Tumby Bay Museum in South Australia, and he notes their activities on the 26th of January 1938. We saw the landing of Governor Phillip, so that must have been a reenactment at Farm Cove, also a pageant, Australia's March to Nationhood in the street, and also went to the showground in the evening. Later, Jack recorded there was a pioneer ball at the evening at the town hall, and on the next evening they enjoyed celebrations in Sydney Harbour with a Venetian display. He also commented there were, in the landing of Captain Arthur Phillip, they saw that there were powdered wigs and three-cornered hats and bright uniforms of the Marines of the First Fleet. It was a striking feature of the reenactments. Now, as we know, Aboriginal people, many of them refused to take part in the sesquicentennial celebrations, the reenactment of Governor Phillip's landing, etc. Instead, the organisers brought in Aboriginal men from Menindee to the reenactment of Phillip's landing, and Maria Nugent and others have written about this. Menindees in Western New South Wales, and we know that they were kept in accommodation at Redfern Police Barracks stables, and they stayed there, or they were sort of really detained, kept there until the reenactment took place. So on the very same day, January 26th, the inaugural National Day of Mourning occurred, and this was held in the city. And this protest, of course, was planned to coincide with the 150th anniversary. It attracted much media attention, and it was the first national gathering of Indigenous peoples protesting against the prejudice and discrimination that was part of their daily lives. And it's known as one of the events that marks the modern Aboriginal political movement. In this image, of course, you see Jack Patton and William Ferguson of the Aborigines Progressive Association, and they told the media, and I quote, "The 26th of January 1938 is not a day of rejoicing for Australia's Aborigines. It's a day of mourning. This festival of 150 years so-called progress in Australia commemorates also 150 years of misery and degradation imposed upon the original native inhabitants by the white invaders of this country." So I think it's very interesting that, the Mortlocks are a very wealthy settler family. They, like many wealthy pastoral families, they have entanglements with the frontier and even with frontier violence. And yet they are collecting Aboriginal weapons simultaneously to this right into the 20th century. Let's turn back to Joe Timbury briefly. So as well as carving boomerangs, he was also renowned for his mastery in throwing them. His exceptional skills not only made him a local legend, but also took him all around the world to showcase the art of boomerang throwing. And later in life, he gave lessons in boomerang throwing to notables, including ABBA, the Bee Gees, and Johnny O'Keefe. He demonstrated his art of boomerang throwing under the Eiffel Tower and in front of the Taj Mahal in Agra. And I think Jack Mortlock, who was saw himself as an empire man, may have been impressed that Joe Timbury presented boomerangs he had personally crafted to Queen Elizabeth II during her 1954 visit. And I'm just going to leave you with these pictures from the newspaper at the time where Joe Timbry meets the Queen. This is just a snapshot of a complex object biography, showing some of the, I guess, uneven and complex relationships of objects and their entanglements in Australia. And questions of dispossession, but also the separate self-representation of Joe Timbry, and the way he used his business to support his family, but also to promote culture. And, you know, I do find the vignette on his boomerangs intriguing, and I think that was his message also to Australians, to think about dispossession and to think about Cook's Landing. So I will close there. Thank you.
Penny, thank you. What a incredibly deeply nuanced discussion about a single item. That was really fascinating. Thank you. But I just wondered if you could both of you comment on the fact that the placement of these things is in the smoking room at Martindale Hall, and this, I presume, is a masculine space. So do we have an element of gender also in the display, the collection, and the placement of these objects?
I think so, yes. I mean, W.T. Mortlock's wife, Rosie, was a very sort of dominant woman, a feature of that house. I mean, of course, they also had a house in Adelaide, but there's a sense in which it was a very masculine space, the idea of, you know, sitting there and smoking with all these weapons. There were guns as well, which we haven't discussed. And across the big open area, the sort of entry foyer, there's the sort of dining room and sitting room. And I suppose, in a way, I think that sitting room is more a sort of feminized type of space.
Yeah, yes, I was wondering that. I was struck too by the fact that the display methods that you can see, and of course I can only see what you show in the slides, look very similar to the display methods that were used in that very old display in the South Australian Museum.
Oh, really? Yes.
It's
You mean
probably
in
not
the
still there anymore.
Pacific collection, yes. Mm.
And Lorinda has asked a question of both of you or one of you. Could another room have offered such rich insights for your project?
Penny?
Oh, yeah, that's a very interesting question. So we did digitally scan in 3D every single room, which was for preservation purposes. There are other rooms we could have focused on. I guess the Empire room or the trophy room is so incredibly rich. We had to, in a way, limit ourselves a little bit. I totally appreciate your comments on gender. I mean, one of the things we wanted to do is to think much more about not just the women in the family, but also the gender dynamics of that family. There are lots of intermarriages. There are children's rooms. You know, it's a very gendered 19th century, late 19th century home. There's, you know, there are rooms for women to retire to. There's the smoking room, etc. One of the intriguing rooms, which does not have objects, but the underground cellars are incredibly interesting because, of course, we were thinking about history from below. We were thinking also about servants and workers at Martindale Hall. So we know that there were many people working downstairs. There were large kitchens and gigantic cool rooms under this huge mansion. So the work of people down below who are literally downstairs is also, I think, really important.
I was also interested to ask, with the really interesting and complex stories that you're telling, the difficult histories, if you like, what the response of the visitors has been, because it's a very different experience from going to many of the great houses, isn't it? Have they been open to these new stories?
I mean, what I can say is that our partners, Sharon and Mick Morris, they're the hosts of Martindale Hall. They are engaged by the South Australian government to look after and care for the hall. They are very busy people. They absolutely welcomed our project. They were wonderful to work with. And they wanted us to find more stories, especially about Aboriginal people, about more about the objects, more about servants and workers, and more about the uh, Aboriginal people in the area. So we have done some of that for them. Now, because it's a National Trust home, we couldn't actually create new displays. And it's also, this house is packed with objects. So we couldn't actually create new displays. But the website is there to augment their interpretation, and they do use it. They direct people to it. We also created posters for them, which they have put up, and also small handouts, which actually detail much more about the Aboriginal people of the area, the Ngadjuri, and also questions of empire and entanglements to sort of augment the information that just absolutely wasn't there. As you will know, historic houses and those kinds of heritage houses really don't get a lot of funding, and they very rarely do they have bespoke curatorial support that carries on for a long time. They might have small kind of projects to help them, but they rarely get any new or academic input. So we really appreciated their collaboration, and we communicated our findings at many different local festivals as well.
It's great. And it's also wonderful that is it your website that's won the award from the History Council of South Australia?
Yes.
Yeah, which is absolutely fabulous. So we should direct everybody to look at that. And it's just great to see such new histories being recognised in that way. A combination, I know, of technology, but also new interpretations. Let me just repeat my thanks to our two wonderful speakers today, Professor Margaret Allen and Professor Penny Edmonds. I think you'll agree that we've had two just engrossing papers, and it was just fabulous. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the team behind Material Histories, Dr. Lorinda Kramer and her colleagues at Deakin University, Katie Dunning at the Old Treasury Building, who manages all the tech expertly, and our colleagues at the Australian Catholic University. A special thanks also to you, our audience. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your questions. The next seminar in the Material History series will be held at the same time, but on a Wednesday. So Wednesday, the 22nd of October, on the topic Consuming Fashion, Fibres and Fun in the 1960s. So I should have said now for something completely different, shouldn't I? But I do hope you can join us. And remember that if you have a paper you'd like to present in this series, we do welcome submissions. And you'll find the details on the Material Histories page on the Old Treasury Building's website. So with that, thank you and good afternoon.